Well, we've got our series that is starting tonight, and it's called Easter Revolution. Easter Revolution. And this is from the book of John, and we're reading from chapters 18 to 20. I'm not going to read it all tonight, and it goes up to 21, in fact. And this series is just a few snapshots based on 4 things that Jesus said during the Easter account as it unfolds. Now, if you've been here a few times, you know John already. He's the person who wrote that mysterious book that we've been looking at called Revelation, the one that I read from in between the first 2 songs. But John, he is describing a point in his life where he's younger when he's writing John. He's writing as an older man, but he's describing part of his life when he was younger. The days when he was on the road with Jesus himself. He was a friend of Jesus. In fact, he was often in the front row as things unfolded. And he got to see all sorts of incredible things. And he would have been able to tell us about people healed, hungry people fed, blind people who could see, dead people who'd been raised to life, stories that Jesus told that just left everyone on the edge of their seat, how religious leaders would come to try to squash Jesus, silence Jesus, impose their structure onto him, and how Jesus just somehow freely showed some other kind of life. And right at the beginning of his book, John explains that this is because Jesus is God himself come to us. He's the revelation of God in our language. He's God here, God become human, God among us. Well, this series is actually a series that was put together for a little church that you pray for just up the road over in Sanderstead. And Sanderstead send their love and greetings tonight. And before we go on a little bit further, I just wanted to just give you a couple of headlines from Sanderstead. The same news is resonating in Sanderstead as is resonating in Caterham and Chaldon, and that is that Jesus isn't dead. He's alive. He's risen. And this is a little postcard. On the back, it's got an invitation. And this week, there's only a group of about 30 of us or so normally up there. But it's growing week by week. But this week, 500 of these invitations are being put through doors across the neighborhood as we invite everyone to come to celebrate the news that Jesus is alive. And so do pray for us. You'll be meeting here in mass, hundreds of us in here. That would be fantastic. But we're praying for a good number of visitors on Easter Day over in Sanderstead. We're really encouraged as new people seem to keep coming. And we're really aware that this is because of God's faithful people who were there already before we ever connected, and also because of your prayers for us up there. So do pray on. But the series that we're going to be going through here in Caterham and over in Sanderstead is these 4 topics. And tonight it's Jesus, the God who comes. And we're going to hear how in John 18 verse 5, Jesus says, I am he. Then next week, Josh is going to be speaking to us about Jesus, the King who dies. Jesus is going to explain to Pilate, my kingdom is from another place. And we're going to be thinking about Jesus, the King who dies. Then do come to the Good Friday event here. James will be speaking about Jesus, the man who pays. As Jesus says, it is finished. James will be helping us to understand that. And then on the evening, Easter Day evening, we're going to be thinking about Jesus, the life who wins. And the shortest sound bite is just Mary. And we're going to be realizing that Jesus, he is alive and he knows your name. And that is really good news. So tonight, Jesus, the God who comes. Jesus, the God who comes. And we're going to turn together in our Bibles to John chapter 18. You might be on your phone, you might have reached to the coffee table to have grabbed your Bible, or please use the Bibles that we've got in the room here. 1086 is the page, 1086. And we're going to be reading just verses 1 down to 9. It starts, of course, in the middle of a story. So let me just tell you what's been going on. Well, Jesus has been meeting with his followers, and they've been sharing a meal. And in fact, we're going to share a similar meal tonight, sharing bread and wine. And they're beginning to understand something of the fact that Jesus is going to lay down his life for them, his body broken and his blood poured out for them. And then after that, Jesus has gone to this olive grove, and groups of us have been there together on the outskirts of Jerusalem. This olive grove, the Mount of Olives. And it's there that this unfolds tonight, the scene that we are going to be reading. But this chapter immediately follows Jesus praying, and Jesus in agony, actually, as he anticipates what is going to be happening as he goes to the cross. This separation of an eternal relationship that is going to be broken in these next hours. Why would he go through that? Well, we'll be thinking about that this evening. So let's invite Jan to come and read to us. We're reading from verse 1 down to verse 9 of John chapter 18. Thanks so much, Jan.
So it's John 18, verses 1 to 9. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me."
Thank you so much, Jan. Let's do something unusual. Why don't we round our tables? You know, we really want us to grow in the way we pray together. And so why not, around our tables, one of us just pray. Don't worry if nobody prays, but I reckon that one of you might have the guts to pray. And just pray very briefly that God would speak tonight as we continue to read. Same as we're around our tables or coffee tables or sitting in that lay-by with your phone. Well, let's just pray briefly now, round our tables, that God would speak. Amen. Thank you. Thank you for leading us. And do remember, you know, that you're sitting next to brothers and sisters, and we can pray with each other as this evening continues, as well as chat together. Well, we've just read this passage, and we're going to see tonight, well, three things. We're going to see how Jesus, how he steps out. You'll see what I mean in a moment. We're also going to see how Jesus has stepped down. How Jesus has stepped down. And finally, we're going to see how Jesus steps in. How he steps out, how he steps down, and how he steps in. Well, here in verse 1, we find him finishing praying, and he crosses the Kidron Valley and he goes to the garden, the olive grove. And this is a place in verse 2 that one of his disciples knows about, because it's a place that Jesus has often gone to. And so in verse 3, this disciple is called Judas. Judas, just a few hours before, had been sharing in this supper. But now he's gone off to get this detachment of officials to arrest Jesus. It's an incredible betrayal. But verse 3, he comes into the garden using his inside knowledge as a friend, and he guides a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And you can see them there geared up. They've got torches at the end of verse 3 and lanterns and weapons. And then this is the verse we're going to linger on for a moment. It's an astounding verse. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out. Jesus, he knew that he was going to be arrested. Jesus knew that he was going to be flogged. Jesus knew that he was going to be shamed, shouted at, mocked, scorned, screamed at. He knew that he was going to be nailed to a cross. He knew that the eternal relationship with his Father was going to be broken. He knew that he was going to hang in humiliation above a crowd who continued to curse him. And he knew that the darkness that was going to come over the land was only a faint echo of the terrible darkness that came over him. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out. Can you imagine that? Can you see that? He doesn't shrink back. He doesn't skedaddle back to some sheltered corner. But this person has such courage, and he steps out. Why did he step out? He stepped out because he was deliberately going to go through this. He was deliberately going to go through this because, as we're going to see, he loves those who have been following him. He loves those he's been sharing his life with, but he doesn't just love them. He loves you. And knowing what was going to happen, Jesus stepped out. And this isn't some obscure idea that we pull out of one verse in the corner of John. But again and again we find that God's eternal plan was that Jesus was going to deliberately come to lay down his life for people like you and like me. In fact, right early on, Genesis, as the book begins to unfold, as the whole history of humanity begins to unfold, there are pictures of how one day God is going to cover our shame, hide our nakedness, deal with our guilt, restore the brokenness, draw distant people in close. And here it is, the culmination of this plan. Jesus steps out. This wasn't some last-minute cobbled together emergency quick fix, but this was God's eternal plan, that he would come in the person of Jesus deliberately to step out and to rescue people like you and me. But not only does this passage speak about the God who steps out, or Jesus deliberately stepping out, it speaks about the God who steps down. Now listen to this. So verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Did you notice that when we read it? It's mysterious, isn't it? It's strange. He doesn't shout. There's not some explosion. There's not something falling down. And yet, the people shrink back as though a grenade has gone off in the middle of where they're standing. They draw back and fall to the ground. It's like they take cover as Jesus says, I am He. Now, here's a little question for our tables. Do you know anywhere and in the Old Testament where we hear a phrase like that? I am He, or something along those lines. Let's talk for a moment round our tables. It might be you've never opened a Bible before. If that's you, that just enjoy listening into the conversation. But let's just for a minute listen in and see if anyone's got any ideas of where we've heard a phrase like that before in the Old Testament. It's great to hear the conversations. I've heard some of those thoughts on the wind. I think you're bang on. So some of you have been listening in. That's great. We're so glad. You know, the Old Testament is really worth exploring. But some of you have been talking about Exodus chapter 3, where there is this man who has been for 40 years just a shepherd, but God is going to lead him, Moses, to rescue a people who will have been in slavery for 400 years by the time they're taken out of slavery. His name is Moses. And as God prepares to commission him, he comes with his sheep around the corner, another day, year 39 and 11 and a half months, and there's a fire burning, but it's a strange one because the fire isn't burning up the bush. It's a fire that doesn't seem to need any fuel. It seems to be able to have its own power without needing anything else. And as he gets close, he's told to take his shoes off because it's holy ground. And as he gets closer, well, God presents himself as the God who is the I am God. I am who I am. I'm the reference point of everything. I am. And you probably thought of other places too. Even in John, in chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus had earlier caused outrage when he had explained to religious leaders, before Abraham was, I am. That's what he said. And people wanted to kill him for that because they spoke the language. They understood that this was a God claim, that Jesus was somehow claiming to be God, that he was above and eternal in comparison to Abraham, in comparison to everything, in fact. He is claiming to be the one to whom all should take their reference point from. Before Abraham was born, I am. And the New Testament and the Old Testament, well, it continues to point to the one who would come, who is God with us. Hebrews 1 verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Colossians 1:17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Even just the chapter before, John 17, verse 5. Now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory I had with you before the world existed. Or further back in John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that chapter continues to explain that this one who is God is going to come here. Unto us a child is born. His name shall be called Mighty God. And Jesus, as he stands in this garden with this troops coming against him and these religious officials coming, this man who'd been so close to him, who's betrayed him, coming against him, he steps out and he says, I am he. He's explaining that he's Jesus of Nazareth, the one they're looking for. And yet, somehow, on Jesus' lips, this phrase, I am, knocks people over, knocks them over to the ground. because he speaks with the authority of God, because he is God here. God stepped down, God among us, God with us. It means that we need to listen to Jesus, doesn't it? He's not claiming to be just another philosopher, teacher, somebody coming with ideas, another fix, another add-on, but he's claiming to be God himself. And if he's God himself, well, everyone is going to fall down before him, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. The New Testament explains it something like this, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is the Lord. And I wonder where you are tonight. Are you still kind of stiff-necked, trying to stand against this claim, this God claim of Jesus? Or are you realizing that none of us can stand in his presence? He is God stepped down. He's God here, God with us. And the only response is to say, Jesus, you are the one I honor. You are the God. I'm going to lay my life down, as we've been singing already. Just as we close, there's one more phrase that I wanted you to remember, and it is this, that he steps in. Let's just continue the dialogue here. Look, verse 7, again he asked them, who is it you want? You can imagine them still lying on the ground. They'd come with all this power, and they are completely disarmed. And from the dust, they kind of stammer back. Jesus of Nazareth, they said. Verse 8, Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. The last is that he steps in. Do you see that? He again presents himself. But then in the middle of verse 8, he says, if you're looking for me, then, you see that? End of verse 8, let these men go. It would have been normal to sweep up everyone, take them all off for punishment together. But Jesus' intention is that these men who he's with at that point would be freed. And so he's calling the shots at this point. And so he has stepped out. He's God who has stepped down, and he steps in. And instead of everyone being arrested, and Simon Peter and others all being, John himself, taken off to be punished too, he does an exchange. He does a deal. He does a swap. And he says, look, take me, let them go. And Jesus steps in. And we're going to see that happen again and again through this Easter story, Jesus stepping in. It's happened actually through history prior to this as well. God has introduced this idea that someone can step in the place of another. There was a point where somebody was about to be killed, and then God stops them, and a lamb is put in its place, and the lamb is killed, and that is sad and gory and bloody and all of that. But this life of a person is rescued because of this lamb that dies instead. And it happens again and again through the Old Testament. And Jesus has been presented as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And here he is. And he says to this attack that's coming against him, he says it's coming against him and against these others, that he will step in. And because of Jesus, well, the attack doesn't touch the others. Actually, they are going to die years later because of their faith in Jesus. All of them are going to die except for John, a violent death. John is not going to have an easy life either. But it's a picture of what Jesus had come to do. You see, Jesus had come to step in. Not just that night his friends wouldn't be arrested, but so that in the ultimate judgment, his friends wouldn't be punished for the rebellion that they have been involved in, engaged in, against the God they were made to know. And so Jesus, he steps in. And there he is later, a few hours after this, hanging on a cross. And we were thinking just now about all the shame and that was being piled onto him, the cursing, and then things we can't see, this separation from God. But he was taking all of that shame. He was being treated as though he'd done all the wrongness that has ever been done in all of the world, in all of time. It was all as though he'd done it all, so that he would be stepping in, so that you wouldn't be in trouble for what you have done, so that I could be forgiven for what I have done. And the reason that different people in this room would tell you about how their lives have been transformed is because they would tell you about the day that they trusted in Jesus and said to Jesus, look, you hung on that cross instead of me. You stepped in. You took the punishment. You took the brokenness. You took the separated relationship. You took it for me so that I could be drawn into the Father's embrace, so that I could be forgiven, so that I could be made whole, so that I could have a forever life in relationship with the God I'm made to know. Jesus, he steps in. Well, I hope that this might have excited you about this passage, and you might keep reading on through it in the days ahead. We had a friend over just a few hours ago, and we were saying, well, why don't we just read 10 verses of John every day? Wouldn't that be a cool thing to do? And if you're not a Bible reader or a thinker about such spiritual kind of things, that would be a great thing to do the next few days. Just read on 10 verses at a time. See where it takes you. You might want to say to God, God, if you're there, if there's something in this, would you show me? And keep reading. Well, there's other ways that this impacts our week. And let's just spend a few moments around our table just thinking about how the fact that Jesus steps out, it's deliberate, his rescue, how he's stepped down, he's God come to us, and how he steps in, how he takes our place, how this impacts the week ahead. Why don't we have a short conversation now around our tables along that theme?